good to see you all. As was just touched upon, I work in a bit different way maybe than most of the speakers here. It's a tough act to follow, not just the robo-dancing, but in general, because what we do, we work in the physical realm using buildings and materials to reimagine a future where people and planet are friends rather than foes. And reimagine is what we do because I believe in order to create something new, and that's really what we must do. We can't just optimize the existent. We need to reimagine and recreate, and then we need to be able to think about it, just having a thought of what the world might look like in the future. And for me, that's one of the key necessary functionalities of design in the future. So this is essentially what we dare to reimagine. A world without resource scarcity, where we don't have a negative impact through our behavior, and where waste does not exist. And to us, that world is real. And I actually mean that quite literally, and hopefully some of our buildings will prove that. There was a picture of the resource road just before, but that world is actually real. We just need to dig it out of all the mess that we as humans have created in the last 50 or 60 years. But underneath that mess, there's actually a world in which this can be real, and the circular economy plays a key part in that. So this, for us, is the main challenges that we're tackling. We're working with the planetary boundaries as the main tool, but CO2, waste, resource scarcity, climate change, and all of the flooding, etc., that we've seen, and then biodiversity loss, as was also touched upon in the initial speaker from on the screen. So those challenges takes a lot of different solutions. What we do and our mission is to design the world of tomorrow with the waste of today, while being mindful that we need to design a world without waste. So when we do our materials, we do it in a way where we are making sure that we are not investing in production equipment, etc. That means that we have to produce with those waste streams 5-10 years, in 5 or 10 years, when hopefully there's a better solution so that we don't become part of the problem ourselves, while trying to short-term use some of the waste that we have today. And there's a need for it. And this is an old picture, it's Denmark, because sometimes when I go talk and people are like, oh, but you also are Dane, so it's so easy for you to do green and everything. But the waste is really a problem. And a secret being that Denmark is the European champion in both waste, incineration per capita, as well as incineration of waste. So far from being the model that we would like to be, we are actually a huge part of creating the problem, and thus in need of much better solutions, and thus having a huge amount of waste, creating an opportunity in the built environment, but of course, long time, we need to design out those waste streams entirely. And so that's a duality. And when we're really struggling at the office, sort of like, should we work with the waste short term, or should we just pretend it's not there and only do long-term solutions? When we see the problems, how dire they are, how can we stay stubbornly optimistic? And we go to this quote that I found a long time ago by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He wrote it in 1937, so it has nothing to do with climate, but it's essentially saying, you know, the test of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposite ideas in mind and say at the same time, and still retain the ability to function. One should be able to see that things are hopeless, and yet be determined to do it, to work towards making it otherwise. And that, for me, is like exactly where we're at today, right? We just had the latest IPCC report coming out on Monday saying, and we're trying to make it into a positive story, right? We can still make it, but it's literally like, we can still make it if we really, really get started today, because things are extremely dire. But of course they have to say we can still make it because we need to continue to work, to continue to do things. And that's where this quote comes in handy for us when we need a little pick up and a reminder of why we're doing what we're doing. So, sometimes I used to say, oh, I'm not a designer, but then I realized actually maybe we're all designers if we just choose to do it in the right way. And for me, this is the designer I want to be. This is the design I want our studio to do working small scale, but also on a systemic level, and going to Buckminster Fuller's version of a designer being a synthesis of an artist, inventor, mechanic, objective economist, and an evolutionary strategist. And of course, this was written more than 50 years ago, but ever so true today. Really, that design enables us to see a different future, but it also enables us to connect between different professions, and we need that more now than ever in the circular economy, but also in general. And so, entering a new world, our world in linear, essentially, and showing you a few of the projects that we're doing. It's not just theory, it's actual work. This is Upcycle Studios. It's 22 row houses in Copenhagen. They were finished in 2018. And they're rented out. I was out there 2 weeks ago in between tenants, and my colleague was saying, maybe you need to be a little bit less excited about the fact that they're actually still standing. But it's a little bit of, because it's like a little bit frightening, but it literally is quite like, for me still, just going out and seeing, okay, there's people that have been living here for 3 years and everything still works. It actually, in reality, it worked too. It wasn't just a nice idea. But so this is the buildings from the other side, 45% CO2 reduction realized, and that's 45% reduction in CO2 per square meter simply by utilizing the resources and the technology that we have today. There is nothing new, there's nothing fancy, it's essentially almost innovation by remembrance of how we used to go about, how we used to do things. So really there's no reason for waiting on new technology, on new ways of doing. We can already do so much that we're not currently doing today. And so how we got there was with these 3 waste streams. The windows delivering definitely the highest amount of CO2 reductions. I'll come back to those. Then we have the wooden cladding. Those are actually Dinesen. They are one of the most luxurious wooden flooring manufacturers in the world for museums, etc. But when you have a luxurious product, you also have a tendency to have a really, really high amount of offcuts, because as consumers, we have very specific demands for what it should look like, what are the sizes, what are not okay, and as well for in terms of quality. So the smallest scratch, and it needs to be discarded. Luckily, we can use it, and we did here. And then the recycled concrete aggregate. And I'll come back to that story, but the interesting thing about the concrete was actually that the main reduction there came not from the recycling, but because we produced the concrete on site, because we crushed it on site and then had a mobile plant, which meant that just from a process optimization, we could reduce the concrete being wasted by more than 10%, so thus reducing the amount of cement that has to be used by more than 10%. Again, just seeing that it's not necessarily about new technology, it's just about plain old simple treating our resources with respect and taking the time to care. So the windows I mentioned, we saw that there's been in the built environment this sort of unfortunate thing where either people are very passionate about energy efficiency, or they're passionate about embedded energy within building the buildings. But the two agendas are kind of at odds more than working together. And so we saw a lot of windows being taken down due to their lack of ability to live up to new energy requirements. But we saw that they really had high value still, and that they were unfortunately being crushed and at best the glass was turned into marmalade glasses. So instead we found that by design, we could essentially reassemble them in this new system where we are putting 2 together, and so reusing the windows, living up to current energy requirements, and doing so without compromising on daylight. And these are essentially how we go about it. We no longer go about it this way anymore, but that's the part of innovation. There's a lot of risk, and someone needs to be able to take that risk, and we tend to be those. So I think a key part of my work is essentially just holding a lot of risk for the involved stakeholders and hoping for the best. So At this project, it was the first time we did the window innovation, and our manufacturing partner, because we produce windows, we produce concrete, we produce plastic, textiles, all these different things, and of course we need partners to help us do those that are best at producing that particular material, and then we source from them. And this, we still work with this producer, but at first they were saying, we think it's interesting, but really, like, those wasted windows, do not bring them near our factory. Please keep them out. We're afraid we won't have them in. What if it ruins our production for a week, and it could be way too expensive? So those windows were actually, the new frames were assembled on the building site, because that was the only place we had that availability. Of course, not the best case scenario, but luckily, due to that, we now have the row houses up, and they, like me, can go and see that, yes, 3 years later, everything is still working, they're still standing. So now we have it in-house at their production, and whenever we find new windows, we can bring them directly to their production. They're stored there, and the windows are now assembled there. So just some of the, the steps that innovation and doing new things takes. It's not going to be the perfect solution from the start, and that's okay. These are the row houses, so they were delivered at benchmark price in terms of square meter. The tenants love living there. It's been rented out much faster than in the area in general, and it has gone to win several awards for the design and the aesthetics, and the engineers saying, yes, it does live up to the energy requirements, daylight, all of the things in terms of comfort that we want. So again, with circular economy, it's feasible to do sustainability without compromise on price, quality, and aesthetics. And this just the window saving, the windows being the biggest one, so 87% CO2 saved on using design to find a new way to reutilize the windows that the engineers deemed not living up to energy requirements, highlighting the importance of rethinking and design. And this just the total overall. In total in this building, 69% of the materials were actually upcycled. Because this is, of course, where we want to go. We want to decouple growth and value creation from the use of resources, and in particular from CO2 equivalent emissions, because we really need that. And I'm certain that myself and probably everybody in this room could and should consume less, but we do have a global population that is increasing, and a global middle class, or a large part of the population coming into middle class, having a roof over their head, running water for the first time. So we know that on the one side, demand is growing, and at the same time, going back to IPCC, they're saying, okay, world demand is growing and the population is growing, but we need to deliver with the same, with 70% less. So doing a lot more with a lot less means rethinking, and the circular way being that way to decouple growth and value from emissions. This was the example that I had on the first screen. It's the resource rows. These are bricks. The main innovation there are bricks, because as you will see here, the sort of the oval. The first thought was that there's a key part. So I mentioned that there's a growing demand due to an increase in population and middle class, and the third being urbanization. So people are abandoning rural areas for urban areas and leaving a lot of buildings behind. And there is currently no financial incentive to take those buildings down and rebuild that area. Instead, they're standing there and they're just decaying more and more and losing value, but also reducing the value for the entire area. So we thought, why can't we take the materials with us when we go into the buildings? And found that particularly in Denmark, the bricks had the biggest problem, but also the biggest potential, because one of the messes that we as people have created is cement, and cement not being properly priced. So essentially we socialized all of the costs of polluting and emitting CO2 while we privatized all of the benefits from it. So there's an imbalance in how we price. So cement is simply just too cheap. So since the 60s, we stopped using lime mortar and went to cement mortar, and thus we can no longer reuse the individual bricks because the mortar that glues the bricks together is much stronger than the individual brick, which makes no sense, because why would you have a glue that's stronger than what it's gluing together? But so we found, okay, there are so many bricks, but we can't reuse them. What can we do instead? Well, we realized we could take a diamond cutter, as it's called, and then turn it into these sandwich elements, which is a very popular notion within the built environment because it's very easy to put together on site. And we found a carpenter in Jutland, quite far out, that was willing to work with us. It was really, really difficult to find someone that would help us with the bricklaying. No one in any proximity to Copenhagen was willing to work with us, but we finally found someone, and we had him come up with this, which was also going, like, you know, because new processes are for the others, but it's also for ourselves. So in this project, we as well had to rethink our role. These are put together at the bricklayer in Jutland, so he's the one doing the color combinations to the very large degree, which for the architects is a very, very difficult thing to just say, okay, you just do that over there, and then we'll be okay with whatever we get. And the same thing for the municipality, right? Because normally you have to have your facade completely approved, and then we also had to go and say to them, if we're going to be able to do that at a fair, like at a balanced price, then we need to do it like this, because otherwise it will be too costly and there will be too many bricks discarded because it's not red or whatever. And everybody came on board. So this is what it looks like today. A very different aesthetics than Upcycle Studios, but this was recently nominated for the Mies van der Rohe Prize from Brussels, and really again highlighting that we can build with the principles of circular economy without compromise. A few of the aesthetics. And then again, we have the reused wood here and the recycled brick. But as you see, it's far lesser material in total that we were allowed by the developer there to use. But we nonetheless had quite an okay CO2 reduction and cost. So how do we decide what to do? We have these 4 tools of opportunity. Reduce, that's always for us and for us in everyday life as individuals. Reduce, just buying, using less, always the most efficient tool. Then there's reuse and recycle, and one of the things that we're currently getting very excited about is replace, in particular bio-based materials, algae, mycelium, all of these different things. And so when we start a project, we look towards these 4 and see how can we utilize each and every one of them. And of course, being mindful that while all are a good place to start and part of the journey, some are better than others if we want to stay within our planetary boundaries. So the best thing, again, reduce. If we reduce, then we're sure to be within the planetary boundaries. If we reuse, we're more certain because we don't use the same amount of energy and we don't need new materials or additives, etc. Recycle, we're still doing hopefully something good, but we need to actually do our life cycle calculations to make sure that we're not, let's say, put in fire retardants that actually means that it ends up not benefiting the environment, then we're not doing it. And then replace really being the joker that I think in 5 years' time will just have shown us a world that we didn't imagine possible today. And so that also means working with different themes within a project. This we did we were very late invited into a competition by the Danish state for the Olympic Pavilion in Tokyo. And it was very clear, it was one team had to leave the competition, and then we came in last minute, and it was very clear that we came in last minute because they were like, oh, sustainability is becoming kind of cool, we need someone that really has that agenda. And then we were thinking, okay, So we're supposed to be the holders of sustainability, but at the same time we need to build a pavilion that has to be really, really structurally strong because it's Japan and earthquake risk, etc. So building an actual building, but a building that's only going to be there for 5 weeks, which for us will always be a paradox. You need to think about lifetime and longevity and have that as long as possible. At the same time, going back to the importance of design, we had a consultancy task for the breweries Carlsberg, who had this material. It's a draft master keg, so it's what their draft beer is being transported and packaged in, but it's a composite plastics. So they had gone to traditional waste management industry, and everybody said, like, if you pay us to take it, we will take it, but there's no value in it because it's a composite, so the best thing you can do is just burn it. And then we got the task of trying to see different opportunities in it, first using it as a facade element, do that to a small degree today, but not a lot, but then also just working with it and going to the tool shop and shredding it as you see and just working with the materials. And what we found was that actually due to it being a composite means that the different types of plastics have different melting points. So when we heat it, not too much, but just a little, it almost starts to look a little bit like marble, and it has the different aesthetics that were actually quite pleasing. And so from there we realized, okay, let's start designing objects with it. And so we've designed a number of objects with it before we then thought, okay, we almost have this plastic material figured out. Let's go where we haven't gone before and create a chair ourselves, but then also use that chair to build the pavilion. And so this is how it ended up being, because of course the Tokyo Olympics was a little bit challenged by COVID. So the Danish state didn't have a desire to have a pavilion built in an Olympic city with no people. So instead it was moved to the Design Week in Japan. But essentially the entire structure being made of a chair that could be directly reused. So you had the draft master material being recycled into a chair that was then used as a pavilion and able to be directly reused as a chair again. And so this is a bit of the design, of course, also looking back to the Danish design heritage. And then because it was for Japan originally, the chair has multiple functionality in terms of being a dining chair in a Western context and a lounge chair or a dining chair in an Eastern context. And just a few of the designs. And this was the original of how it was supposed to have been. The Danish crown prince ensured that the Danish pavilion had a really, really just the most beautiful spot and everything. So hopefully sometime in the future we will be able to bring it to Tokyo, but unfortunately not this time. And this is a bit of how it ended, just from a different view. But the reason why I have it is actually what you should notice is the roofing. That's the same technique that we've created our own materials with and how we've worked. But it's open source tools that are really cheap. It's very non-tech. It's advanced low tech at best. And so what we found was that we could partner with the group, not Doctors Without Borders, but Architects Without Borders, who, with the NGO CARE, had a project in a refugee camp in Uganda, where a key problem was, on the one side, that they have extreme amounts of waste, but they also have an issue of how they built, because it being a UN camp, they're not allowed to do, they're only allowed to do temporary housing. So they use wood that rottens, and then they just have to take more and more wood from the surrounding areas. And that camp, unfortunately, while temporarily, has been there since the Rwanda war. So Morten, the guy in the picture, a colleague, when he was there the first time, he met a woman who was both born and had given birth in the same camp. So really helping them find a way to protect their buildings so that they don't use the same amount of wood was also super meaningful to us. So what we did was have them collect all of their waste And then this very simple, it's a company called Precious Plastic that just sells these super simple, quite cheap open source materials so you can shred and make it into new materials. And then we did it for them, but also just sold it to the Danish government and have the Danish crown princess look at it and open it. So also creating skills, but also proudness in the camp. And so for me, what that goes to is that architects and design has the opportunity to bridge the gap between our problems and the solutions of where we need to go by turning our problems into potentials. And the reason why it's this slide, or this picture on the slide, is that, I don't know if you probably no one can guess what it is. This is what it looks like in the rendering without the text, and so it's our new build, but it's not finished yet, but it's coming up. And the white thing you see is actually this. So it's wind turbine blades. That is a huge problem because they're all being landfilled, and it's a part of the wind turbines that we can't really find usage for. So we found that in this high-rise, wooden high-rise we're building in Denmark for a pension fund, so a pension fund also heavily invested into wind, we found this way of, again, using design to turn those wings into solar shading for the building, thus playing a small part in solving the problems of the wind turbine wings. Waste. It's this one, tier 3, a sustainable tower, and again, using what we know on wood, getting a lot of new knowledge as well, and then the window innovation that we had at Upcycle Studios, but then accelerating it to higher usage in this building. The windows, you can see a little bit that it's the same as we had at Upcycle Studios, but just now in a much larger scale. And then just a few more renderings. It's a project currently being worked on, so there's a lot of excitement within. And then just on a final note, because I had to do this new strategy for the board, and there was this sort of like, wait, but like, what is strategy actually to us? We don't really like strategy at all because it just, most of the time it turns out to be like a document that takes a year to write, and then no one does anything that acts because they're waiting for the strategy document to be finished, and then by the time it is, you need to do a new one because the world has changed so much. So this is sort of our collection of the things that we want to do rather than traditional strategy, and more than anything it's about enabling action. So of course design for circularity, but again enlightened action being the key thing. So we have architects, we have engineers, we have business people within the company, but the key thing is that it needs to be about enabling action. Everything that we do has to be about that action becomes before, oh, but what we said this is in the process document. It's great that we have a document highlighting how the process should be, but we all know that the process is not going to be that way because it really comes down to how we enable action the best. But the guidelines being with both eyes open, it's a notion from a research project out of Cambridge, really seeing that with energy efficiency and engineering, we had the opportunity to open one eye and do less bad, optimizing the existing by doing less bad. But circular economy really needs to be about doing good. So really seeing how can our solutions actually not just be about limiting the problem, but turning buildings into part of the solution. And then reach for the stars. We need to be super, super ambitious. The only way we get there is if we have multiple problems and turn it into one solution. Otherwise, it's not going to be feasible, actually. I think one of the key problems is that we're not ambitious enough, and then we don't have enough buy-in from the necessary stakeholders. We don't have enough that are gaining enough by what we're trying to do. So actually, for us, ambition is a key feature, and it's actually dangerous and risky if we're not ambitious. Trial and error. We need to be very much better at this, and it's super, super difficult when we start a new project and we say, okay, so the thing is, going back to reaching for the stars and ambition, if we by end of this project haven't made mistakes, if we haven't failed at anything, we haven't been ambitious enough. We haven't done enough in terms of mitigating climate change. And everybody likes that notion in theory, but most of the time the developer or the entrepreneur will say, well, that's great, but like, I will lose my job. So there's an importance in all of us just being much better at really helping each other, realizing that it's part of the journey, and also just accepting and being super open when people say, oh yeah, shit, I failed, rather than pointing fingers at them and saying, oh, you did something really, really bad. Just embracing them and helping them move forward is for us a key feature. And then local is global. Even just, this is not that far from Copenhagen, but even just being with the universities here, seeing what they're doing with mycelium, like there's so many opportunities for all of us to just learn from each other and realize there might not be others like us in Denmark, but there might be someone quite like us in Helsinki or in San Francisco or whatever, and we really need to be much better at helping each other, enabling each other, working with each other, building on each other's solutions, and enabling each other to stay optimistic. And in that sense, globalization is really an important feature, because for all the bad it does, there's also just that opportunity of not having to do everything ourselves, but actually being able to just do things much quicker because we can learn based on the things that others have done. And then, of course, building on the Danish design heritage, taking the time to care. It sounds so simple, but it's just something that we clearly have such a hard time doing, and something that we just all need to be much, much more mindful of, that is taking the time to care about aesthetics, about materials, about craftsmanship, and about usage. We are way too focused on exchange rather than use value today. So really going back in time and taking the time to care is for us maybe the most important thing to check in a project that we do. Yeah? And then with that, I'll leave you with this. My thanks, and the new book coming out later this year, which is funnily enough exactly about the Danish design heritage and global sustainability and taking the time to care. Yeah? Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, I think everybody in the room would like to sign up for a row house like this. And this is not really typical for Germany, because in Germany a Reihenhaus is, well, so yeah, great. And it's for us in our own journey with the conference, it's good to see that things that like 5 or 6 years ago were like small initiatives that were totally like crazy, and we say, wow, they are doing this, but you can't do it on scale. Now you see this has an industrial level that you reach there. Vielleicht können wir das Saallicht mal anmachen, so schwierig von hier oben zu sehen, ob sich jemand meldet. One question I have, because the windows, but especially the second project, it has a very specific aesthetic.
Yeah.
And what do you think? Should we try to make it work on scale, also with a larger public?
Yeah.
Do we need to imitate the look of products and projects and architecture that is built with virgin materials, or is it important actually for the marketing of that concept to make it different, to make it special in a way? And what's your take on that?
I think the most important thing is that we use it, and the fact, whether it's materials like what we do or whatever strategy you have in terms of sustainability, but that you use it as a positive creative constraint rather than this sort of ability to be, oh, it's okay, it's a little bit more ugly or something. It always needs to be that positive creative constraint, which also goes back to the design heritage of really having a social purpose, and then mixing that with form and functionality, and so that you heighten the overall expression. And that's the most important, I think, right now, because a key driver for these types of, for sustainability in general, is brand and brand value. So there is an interest for things to look in a certain way. We can also see with our materials, it's the materials, we do acoustics, and then we did acoustics for Novo Nordisk, the medical company, and then they have part of it that is not visible, and then they have part that are acoustics that are visible on the wall, and they can tell the story again and again and again.
Yeah.
And of course, that's what they want more of, right? Because that's a key value driver at the moment. But I think that will change, because as long as it's that, it's going to be the niche rather than the mainstream. So we need to be able to do both.
Ja. Wir haben Fragen. Wie schön.
As you are building your buildings from recycled materials, how is it about the recycling of the buildings themselves in the end after?
So after our buildings go down, so of course we're super mindful that we design for disassembly and do as best possible to not make it difficult to reuse or recycle them. In the end, it's what we were trying to do with the pavilion as well. That also having the opportunity, well, it was bad that it had to go down so shortly, but it also gave that opportunity for the developer to have the incentive to design for disassembly. It is an issue in general that developers are not willing to take too much risk in that regard, because they don't expect that they will own the building at that point in time. But we definitely tried as best as possible to, and in terms of not using additives that are ruining the material, if we work with plastics and textiles, yeah.
There's a question here in the front. Go on, micro. Oh, you're next.
You said that you did have a bit of trouble finding partners or companies to work with, contractors. Did you see a perspective shift when closing the project, and are they more open to work with you in the future?
Yeah, definitely. The Upcycle Studios and Resource, they were built. Well, Upcycle Studios in 2018 and it was finished, and Resource was in the beginning of 2019, and that has changed everything, because all of a sudden it's tangible, it's reliable, and everybody. So now it's much easier to find partners and to find the waste streams and everything. Like it used to be that we had to have a team sitting by the phone, going out finding the materials. Now we have a lot of people coming to us with the materials, and for a lot of developers, we actually map their building stock in terms of what materials they have and when they're being demolished, in beforehand, knowing how it should be done so it can be demolished selectively.
Thank you. Great to hear.
Thank you. Yeah.
How do you convince the building departments of Denmark to build with that kind of materials, because you already have some difficulties to find partners?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a traditional sector and it's a conservative sector, so there's definitely, it's not the easiest to work with. I think there are many, like one thing is this, we have this notion of presumption of possibility, so we just believe that it's feasible and then we just keep at it until we get there. And then we try to communicate a vision as best as possible and really work with the developer in terms of what matters to them. So for instance, like it's very often that when we do a presentation, like going back to the brand value, we will have a newspaper with our vision and that project on it, so that the developer can see, oh, if we allow for this, we might actually end up on the front page of that news. So just like helping them visualize that it's not just about the building, there's also intangible benefits for them, because we know that, I mean, it's all about using whatever drivers there are, and if brand is a key driver, then we're happy to use that as long as the tangible actual effects is what it should be.
Okay. One more last question? I don't think so. Can't see anything. One last question from me. How important is it that materials come from the surrounding of a building site? Because transportation, of course, is a big issue when it comes to emission. How do you deal with that?
We try to, well, it varies on the project, because there's sometimes it matters, but many, like if we're talking about concrete, now we're working with reusing structural concrete. You can transport that from crazy far, and it will still be much better than doing so. So transportation, in some instances, and we try to limit it as much as possible, because we try to limit everything as much as possible. But it's more from a creative concept of trying to look at like the available resources. But if there are high value resources that are coming from afar, we're happy to use that as well, because there's still a large benefit to it. And also just with the scaling of things, we're also sometimes in need of, so like the windows are produced, all of the windows are produced at the same plant and the same manufacturer.
Yeah.
So the windows are taken up there, and then we move them along, and that's still better in terms of the life cycle analysis, and the product will be better because they are the best at producing windows.
Well, I'm looking forward to see something like this in Wiesbaden while I live.
We're starting in Berlin now, so.
Okay, comes clear. So if you meet Dave Hackens from Precious Plastic, please say hello, because he was a speaker on the Sea Conference a few years ago. So it's nice to see things come together.
Yeah, we're very happy with their products.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ditte, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Oh, I should bring this.